This is one of the most overlooked passages in the history of science. We're getting to theory. We're getting to what's going on. As you know, in the 1800s, there was this growth of vitalism, even mesmerism, which sort of fell by the way. But people were discovering things, playing with new concepts. And the guy who I did my thesis on actually wrote about magnetizing the will in nature in 1836. Now, what I'm reading here is from von Reichenbach, who took sensitives, who he described as the people who hid in the corners during parties. He rounded those people up. He would put them in darkened rooms, and for 6 hours, 8 hours. It's all documented. And he would cover this crystal, then he would uncover the crystal, he would ask the person to find it, and they would all describe the same thing. Oh, namely that there was an energy. Off of one end there was a cool blue light, which was actually the south, and off the other end there was an ugly brown energy, which is actually the north end. All right, so that happened over and over. So he's reflecting on this. He says, why? What then actually these effects are above described? If you should press me for an answer, I should feel obliged to avow, I don't know. I mark the manifestation of a dynamite. In other words, I see a new energy, but I'm unable to record it amongst anything known. If I'm not mistaken in judging about the facts proved by my experiments, this phenomenon is to be placed between magnetism, electricity, and heat, but it ought not to be identified with either of them. What an astonishing claim. And so I've chosen to designate it by the word ud. Now, if you think this stuff doesn't have an influence, and you think the word ud sounds familiar, it's because it became Freud's id, based on the raging will in nature, the raging unconscious. So it's all tied up together. There's another philosopher in there, Edward von Hartmann, who wrote The Philosophy of the Unconscious. But the point here is that he has a heat energy which he can't describe. Where would we find that? It's in the infrared. There's no question. Let's think about our unit under test in the double shielded cage, okay? This is why I say it's infrared. So let's say we have this nice shielded box. All your radio engineers will tell you anything can't get in there. But we know if we shine a sun lamp on that double-walled steel cage, the outer cage of steel will start to heat up. Then the inner cage will start to heat up. And then the device under test will start to heat up. So what's happened? We've passed through the shielding with infrared. Yes? I love this picture. This is from 1989, Time Life, and it really tells the story. Down here you have our basic frequency range goes along here now, sort of this z-axis. So down here we have our telephone, our low frequency communications, and here's our radio stations, and then TV and broadcast and wireless and satellites. And you have media here, you have wires and you have coax, and then what's going on here? They do have the prescience to have optical cable up here across visible and ultraviolet. What's happening here? What? Hello? There's a big hole here, which is the infrared. We don't know anything about it. The reason it gets frustrating is because it's the limit of electronics and the transition to optics. That's why we don't have little dishes on our eyes for glasses. Because even though it's one electromagnetic spectrum, it behaves entirely differently as it increases in frequency. Of course, everybody knows that above the visible spectrum, you get all this high-end radiation, UV, X-ray, gamma. But Planck's constant is a constant, which is what you multiply frequency by to get your photonic energy. Therefore, there is photonic energy down here. And that's a missed opportunity. The other thing I want to point out is that this communication model, that's why I put the Tacoma Bridge here, this whole thing is based on resonance. High-powered resonance in basically a single channel communicating stuff across here. And the problem with that is that it's killing us. I'm sorry. You can adopt your industrial point of view, your bias, but it's just indisputable. You can read Becker. The problem is that as frequencies increase, wavelengths decrease, and they therefore achieve the ability to attack our cells and, more disturbingly, to damage and knock out of place the chromosomes of our children. And just to emphasize the point, puffing is not smoking. The English are really, they have a cute way of putting things. You don't get robbed, it's a smash and grab. Well, puffing is I learned about this 2 years ago. When I went to England and talked to people about this who had been sickened and had to move from radio towers, she being a former Minister of Health for the government. Puffing is a well-known phenomenon in England where when a bird flies in front of a microwave tower, it disappears. Puff. That's what we're doing to our kids. Specific absorption rate is a nice way to build, if you want to rate specific devices. That's the only fair thing to do. You can only look at one device at a time, but the fact is, we're surrounded by this stuff. So what does specific absorption rate of a single thing have to do with the real world? Nothing. So that resonant model is destructive, it's killing us. In that place, I offer this, which unifies the experimental work we've done, figures out what Tiller's done, and gives us a way forward without poisoning ourselves, as well as new technological opportunities. I am not a member of the Tesla cult. However, there is some indication that he was disappointed at the end of his life with what he was doing, and a lot of people have tried to take his work in different directions. If there is another way to encode or transmit information within the existing electromagnetic spectrum, this is the only way to do it, via what I call the subtle Timbral Spectrum model. Here's our fundamental frequency of our device. Here are the overtones it generates according to all the methods that I've described. I suggest that it's a timbre, it's very subtle, and the reason we haven't seen it is because, again, we don't have technology that looks across all these ranges simultaneously, at least until just very recently. These all have different qualities. It takes different signal processing to try and correlate information across the entire spectrum, unless, of course, that's exactly what the boxes are doing. So you think I'm crazy at this point until this comes out. For nature to admit that our major organ is covered with infrared sensitive radios is not only astonishing in itself, but it's absolutely confirming with what I'm saying. Now you can argue whether 90 gigahertz is microwave or infrared. It's a matter of terminology. I use microwaves in a destructive context. Obviously, whatever system this is not destructive, so I would refer to it as infrared or light. The article actually discusses higher frequencies, 100, 110. For reference, the background radiation, infrared radiation from the Big Bang, is 160 gigahertz. So it makes perfect sense that there's a Big Bang and then we have redshift. Everybody knows about that. Things slow down. Big Bang, everything starts to slow down. You have redshift. So if you have a Big Bang at 160 gigahertz, we stretched out, slowed down over 13 billion years. It makes a lot of sense that through Doppler we would be operating and receiving general universal information at this frequency. All right, sum it up. If you pay attention, there are two things going on here. There's Tiller's stuff, which I don't talk about because, frankly, I'm not qualified to speak about the quantum mechanics. But what I do say is that what we have apparently demonstrated is a U1 level correlation. I better get into gauge state before I talk about this too much more. Our model is not resonant. If you think about an ocean surface or mountainsides, that's really what we're more talking about. And that's a lot closer to chaos theory, fractals, all that kind of stuff. Whereas, consider the opposite case. We know that resonance is destructive, as in the case of the famous Ella Fitzgerald wine glass. Hurricanes and earthquakes are natural oscillations without negative feedback, which are extremely destructive. I think that my theory explains the imprinting process, particularly when you have a lot of these subtle frequencies lining up in phase coherence to create a rogue wave. The entanglement occurs from the fact that our entire world is based on crystal. This is carbon. Now, carbon itself is not a crystal. You can drive it into a diamond and it becomes a crystal, or you can let it be graphite, which is a crystal, or you can have it take one of these allotropic forms, which is obviously crystal. And we are carbon-based life forms. I read that carbon combines to make over 10 million substances, so it's all over the place, as is calcium. That's what unites us with all the physical stuff.